No one showed up to the CEO's daughter's birthday, not one child. But when a poor black boy knocked on the door and asked, "Can I join?" that single moment of kindness would ignite a battle that shook an entire city. No one came. That was the cruel truth hanging heavy in the air of the Mitchell mansion that afternoon. The dining hall was dressed in pastel perfection, 24 pink balloons floating lazily above rows of chairs that remained stubbornly empty. The long banquet table groaned under the weight of untouched delicacies, tiered trays of cupcakes with delicate frosting, crystal pitchers filled with soda, and at the very center, a towering castle-shaped cake that looked more like a museum piece than something meant to be eaten. A $1,000 clown leaned against the wall, bored, flicking through his phone, his painted smile drooping as if mocking the silence. In the middle of all this spectacle sat Emma, Robert Mitchell's only daughter, a small body framed by the custom-made wheelchair that had become her reluctant companion since the accident. She tilted her head up, eyes wide, with a mixture of hope and confusion. "Daddy, when are my friends going to arrive?" Her voice was soft, like a note carried on fragile glass, echoing against the marble floors of the mansion. Robert glanced at his Rolex for the 10th time, as though staring at its face long enough could somehow make the hands spin faster and bring children rushing to the door. 2 hours had passed since the party was supposed to begin. Not a single child had shown up. He forced a smile, adjusting his Italian silk tie. "They're probably stuck in traffic, sweetheart. You know how parents are, always running late." But the lie tasted bitter on his tongue, and even as he said it, his gaze shifted toward the rows of empty chairs. A silent jury delivering its verdict on his daughter's worth. Emma turned the wheels of her chair gently, rolling toward the table where small pastel-colored bags had been carefully arranged. She had filled them herself days before, tiny treasures of stickers, candies, and plastic trinkets meant to delight her classmates. She had insisted on picking each item. "So they'll like me, Daddy," she had whispered back then, her face glowing with anticipation. Now the gift bag sat untouched, perfectly arranged, perfectly useless, marking the sincerity of a little girl who still believed in friendship. Robert's chest tightened as he watched her run her small fingers over the ribbons, her lips pursed, as if holding back the words she was afraid to say. He remembered Margaret, his wife, who had died in the same accident that had taken Emma's legs. He remembered her telling him once that children's laughter was the purest sound in the world. But the silence in this mansion had grown so heavy, it pressed down on him like a weight he could no longer carry. Only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the squeak of Emma's wheels against the polished floor. The clown cleared his throat awkwardly, as if to ask if his services were still needed. Robert waved him off with a curt nod. What was the point of balloon tricks when the audience had already abandoned the show? Emma glanced toward the grand double doors again, her face lighting up each time as if the sound of the wind brushing against the iron gates could be footsteps. Each time, disappointment settled deeper in her chest. "Maybe they forgot," she whispered finally, her voice trembling like a leaf. Robert crouched down to meet her at eye level, forcing another smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No, sweetheart, no one could ever forget you." But even as he spoke, he knew she didn't believe him. He didn't believe himself either. In that moment, Robert Mitchell, the most powerful pharmaceutical CEO on the East Coast, a man who had built an empire and bent competitors to his will, stood powerless in front of a reality he couldn't manipulate with money or influence. His daughter had been abandoned by those who should have been her friends, not because of who she was inside, but because of what she had lost. And there, under the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by wealth and emptiness, the cruel lesson unfolded. Sometimes the loneliest place in the world is not the slums, but the grandest house in town. The sound came like a crack of thunder in the silence. A sharp ding from the ornate brass doorbell echoed through the marble halls, startling Robert so much he nearly dropped his glass. He straightened his tie, heart pounding. Finally, he thought, finally someone had come. Maybe Patricia's daughter, or the Chen twins, or one of the Vanderbilt boys, someone from the endless list of children who had promised they would attend. He rehearsed his best executive smile as he strode to the door, already picturing Emma's face lighting up with relief. But when he pulled open the heavy wooden door, his smile faltered. Standing on the marble steps was not a polished little guest in a tailored blazer or frilly dress. It was a boy. Black, maybe 8 years old, skinny, his Superman t-shirt faded and full of holes, jeans patched in 3 places, and sneakers that had clearly run more miles than they were ever meant to survive. The boy's eyes, though, shone brighter than the chandelier above Robert's head. "Hello, sir," he said politely, almost timidly, but with a confidence that didn't match his clothes. I heard there was a birthday party here. He pointed past the iron gates toward the rows of public housing visible in the distance. My name is Jamal. I live just down the street. Robert blinked. Words caught in his throat. Of all the wealthy children who had turned their backs, it was this boy from the projects who had come knocking. Jamal shifted from one foot to the other, his hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets. I don't have an invitation, he admitted, voice steady, and I don't have a present, but I can sing happy birthday really loud if that's okay. I just saw the balloons in the window and thought maybe the birthday girl was feeling lonely. Robert's instinct was to say no, to explain that this was not how things worked in Westfield society. He opened his mouth, the words balanced on the edge of his tongue, but before he could speak, the faint squeak of wheels rolled across the polished floor behind him. Emma had heard the door. She maneuvered her chair into the foyer, curiosity shining on her small face. "Daddy, who is it?" she asked, peeking from behind his leg. Jamal's eyes widened, and a grin spread across his face, revealing a missing front tooth. "Hi, you must be the birthday girl," he said brightly. "Happy birthday. I'm sorry I don't have a gift, but I promise I can make your party fun." Emma's lips twitched, then curved upward into something Robert hadn't seen in months, a genuine smile. She giggled, the sound light and unguarded. "You'd really stay at my party?" she asked softly. Jamal nodded without hesitation. "Of course I would. Birthday parties are the best thing in the world." For a moment, Robert stood frozen, watching a stranger accomplish in seconds what doctors, therapists, and teachers had failed to do. His daughter was laughing. Not the forced laugh she gave when adults told clumsy jokes, but a bubbling laugh, alive and free. Emma clapped her hands against the arms of her wheelchair. "Daddy, can he come in, please?" Her voice carried a pleading note, but her eyes danced with something new, hope. Robert's carefully constructed world of status and appearances wavered under the weight of that look. He swallowed hard, realizing that in the middle of this empty mansion, the only guest who had come was the one nobody had expected. And yet, he was already the most important. The mansion's back garden had never looked so alive. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the trimmed hedges and marble fountains, the kind of glow that seemed designed for glossy magazines rather than real life. Birds darted from tree to tree, their songs breaking the silence that had weighed on the Mitchell house for too long. In the middle of the lawn, Jamal was pushing Emma's wheelchair with the kind of joy only children could summon, his laughter carrying high above the garden walls. "You're the fastest princess in the world," he shouted, steering her carefully along the stone path. Emma's arms lifted in delight, her hair catching the sunlight, her giggles echoing like a melody long forgotten. For a moment, she wasn't the lonely girl left behind by friends or the fragile child doctors treated like porcelain. She was just a 7-year-old on the ride of her life. Robert watched from the tall window in the study, his hand still resting on the curtain as though anchoring himself to reality. He had seen therapists work with Emma, professionals trained to coax smiles with carefully designed exercises. He had paid for interactive workshops, art sessions, even trips to amusement parks with specialized staff. And yet none of them had cracked the invisible wall around his daughter. But here, in less than 10 minutes, a boy from the housing project had done what none of the experts could. He had made her laugh until her cheeks turned red. Jamal stopped suddenly in the middle of the path and raised a hand dramatically, as if calling for a pit stop. "Princess Car needs fuel," he announced, crouching to check the wheels. Emma clapped her hands and leaned forward in excitement. "What kind of fuel?" she asked. Jamal looked up with wide eyes, pretending to think. "Soda," he said finally, "lots of soda." Emma laughed so hard she almost choked. She leaned back too quickly, and for a terrifying second her wheelchair tilted at an angle. Robert's breath caught in his chest, but before panic could settle, Jamal's hands were there, steady, firm, holding the chair upright. "Got you," he said gently, his tone suddenly serious, protective in a way that seemed far too mature for his age. Emma looked at him with a mixture of surprise and trust, then whispered, "Thank you." Robert's grip on the curtain tightened as the weight of that moment pressed against him. He realized Emma wasn't just smiling, she was trusting again. That fragile bond, broken since the accident, had been stitched back together not by wealth or privilege, but by a boy who had nothing material to offer. Jamal straightened and grinned again, quickly turning the near accident into another game. Princess Car repaired, ready for takeoff. Emma raised her hands like wings, and the laughter resumed, filling the air, filling the garden, filling the hollow spaces inside Robert that had felt empty for 2 years. As the two children circled the garden, inventing stories of dragons, castles, and imaginary races, Robert let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The strangest thought crossed his mind. Maybe healing didn't come wrapped in medical bills or delivered by renowned specialists. Maybe healing came in the form of a boy with patched jeans and a fearless heart, a boy who saw Emma not as a problem to be solved, but as a friend to be cherished. From the study window, Robert Mitchell, master of markets and deals, stood humbled. In 10 minutes, Jamal had restored something he thought he had lost forever, the sound of his daughter's unguarded joy. The sound of laughter floated through the open window, high and bright, carried on the late afternoon breeze. Emma's giggles rose above Jamal's playful shouts as they raced across the garden path, the squeak of her wheelchair wheels mingling with the chirping birds. Robert stood in his study, his eyes drawn again and again to the sight of his daughter's face, lit with a joy he hadn't seen in years. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the warmth like a blade. He hesitated before picking it up, his gaze still lingering on the children. "Robert Mitchell," he answered, voice low. On the other end came a voice as smooth as ice. "Robert, this is Patricia Vanderbilt." The name alone carried weight in Westfield, a woman who ran the board of the most exclusive private school and pulled strings across the city like a puppeteer. "We need to talk about a matter of concern." Robert straightened, instinctively defensive. "What matter, Patricia?" Pause, deliberate, almost condescending. "Some mothers have called me. They tell me there's a child different playing on your property, a child who doesn't belong in our social circle." Outside the window, Jamal pushed Emma in wide circles, both of them laughing so hard they nearly toppled over. The contrast was unbearable. Robert's jaw clenched. "You mean Jamal, the boy who cared enough to show up for my daughter when no one else did?" Patricia's tone grew sharper, dripping with disdain. "Robert, you need to understand. We have traditions here, standards. We don't want Emma exposed to unsuitable influences, especially given her fragile condition." Robert felt the blood rush to his face. He turned away from the window, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. "He's 8 years old, a child, the only one who gave my daughter back her smile." Patricia's reply was cold, surgical. "You're being naive. These people always have motives. They see opportunity where you see kindness." Her words sliced through him with the precision of a knife. Robert froze, the venom sinking deeper with every syllable. He wanted to shout, to unleash the fury building in his chest, but outside, Emma's voice rang out, pure and unbroken, as she cried, "Faster, Jamal, faster." He closed his eyes for a moment, torn between two worlds, the pure innocence of children and the poisoned whispers of the elite. When he opened them again, his reflection stared back at him from the glass pane, a man standing on the edge of a choice that would define not just his daughter's future, but his own. Patricia's voice lowered, carrying a final warning. "Think carefully, Robert. Our community remembers these things, and people who forget their place rarely find forgiveness." Then the line went dead, leaving only the hum of the dial tone and the distant sound of Emma's laughter. Robert lowered the phone slowly, his chest heavy with rage he could no longer ignore. In that silence, one truth became clear. The battle had already begun, and it was no longer about birthday parties or appearances. It was about dignity, prejudice, and a war that would test everything he thought he knew about loyalty and justice. 1 week later, the cracks began to show. It started on Monday morning with a call from his assistant, her voice shaking as she explained that one of their oldest pharmaceutical clients had suddenly withdrawn a multimillion-dollar contract. No warning, no explanation, just a polite letter citing strategic realignment. Robert knew better. Strategic realignment was code for pressure, the kind that came from whispered conversations in country clubs and boardrooms where handshakes carried more weight than legal documents. On Tuesday, the blow came from another direction. At the Westfield Golf and Country Club, the place where Robert had closed deals and built alliances for over 15 years, the manager greeted him with a forced smile. "Mr. Mitchell, a few of our members have expressed concerns about recent associations. Perhaps it would be wise to reconsider certain social priorities before renewing your membership." The words were wrapped in civility, but the meaning was poison. He was being pushed out, marked as contaminated, not because of business, but because of a child who had dared to befriend his daughter. That night, Robert sat in his study long after midnight, staring at the piles of documents on his desk. Every number, every contract, every decision he had made in his career had been built on logic and control. But now, logic was useless against the invisible hand squeezing him from all sides. By Wednesday, he could barely think about work at all, because that was the day Emma came home from school with red eyes, her small hands trembling as she wheeled herself through the front door. Robert rushed to her side, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Emma bit her lip, her voice breaking. "The girls at lunch, they said if I keep being friends with Jamal, I'll have to sit alone forever. They said I'll never be part of their group again." Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she buried her face against his shoulder, her words muffled by sobs. "Daddy, am I wrong for choosing him?" The question cut deeper than any lost contract or revoked membership. Robert felt something break inside his chest, a helplessness he had never known. He had faced ruthless competitors, hostile takeovers, entire industries trying to bring him down, but nothing had ever left him so powerless as watching his little girl question the worth of her only true friend. He held her tighter, whispering words of comfort he wasn't sure he believed. "No, sweetheart, you're not wrong. You're braver than all of them." But in his heart, anger boiled. This was no longer about a child's birthday party. It was no longer about whispers of disapproval from people who wore pearls and sipped champagne while pretending to be virtuous. This was a war. Someone, no, an entire class of someones, had decided that the price for his daughter's happiness was too high, and they were determined to make him pay for defying their unspoken rules. He thought of Patricia Vanderbilt's voice on the phone, cold and calculated, warning him that these people always have motives. He thought of the contracts, the club, the tears staining his daughter's cheeks. And for the first time, Robert Mitchell understood that he wasn't fighting for reputation or profit. He was fighting for Emma's right to live without shame, for Jamal's right to be seen as more than a stereotype, for the simple truth that children should not be punished for kindness. He rose from the floor that night with Emma asleep in his arms, her face streaked with tears but her breathing soft and steady. He carried her to bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered a promise to himself. If the powerful families of Westfield wanted to play their games, then so be it. But they had underestimated him. They thought they were dealing with a man worried about status. What they had awakened, instead, was a father with nothing left to lose, and that was the most dangerous kind of man. Robert had driven past the housing projects hundreds of times before, but never once had he slowed down long enough to notice the lives hidden behind those faded brick walls. That Friday evening, however, he parked his black Mercedes at the edge of the lot, stepping out into a world that smelled of cooking spices, motor oil, and the laughter of children echoing through cracked courtyards. The Rodriguez apartment was on the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim, the paint peeling. But when the door opened, Robert was met not with despair but with warmth. The small living room was immaculate, the furniture old but polished, the walls decorated with family photos and colorful drawings taped proudly as if they belonged in a gallery. At the center stood a woman with silver hair tied neatly in a bun, her posture straight, her eyes calm and steady. "Mr. Mitchell," she greeted in careful English. "I am Carmen, Jamal's grandmother. Please come in." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had endured too much to be shaken by appearances. Robert stepped inside, and the air changed. The room was filled with the smell of beans simmering on the stove, the sound of a small radio playing faint Spanish melodies, and the unmistakable undercurrent of dignity. Dona Carmen gestured for him to sit, offering a chipped teacup filled with steaming chamomile. "Jamal told me about the problems," she said, her eyes searching his face. "I am sorry if our friendship has caused your family trouble." Robert shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. You have nothing to apologize for. Your grandson has given my daughter more joy in a week than she has felt in 2 years. Dona Carmen's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Then maybe God sent him to your house for a reason." The front door opened again, and a man entered, his boots caked in dust, his construction uniform stained with paint and grease. Shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his eyes carried pride. "This is my son, Miguel," Carmen said. Miguel wiped his hands on a rag, extending one toward Robert with a firm grip. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice deep but respectful, "I'm sorry I look like this. Work ran late." Robert studied him for a moment, the strong arms, the rough palms, the quiet dignity of a man who built with his hands. "You look like someone who works harder than most men I know." Robert replied. They sat together at the small table, plates of rice and beans laid out, simple but served with honor. The conversation flowed easily, and Robert found himself listening more than speaking. Miguel spoke about waking before dawn, about working 2 jobs to keep food on the table, about raising Jamal with values stronger than any paycheck. "We don't want charity," Miguel said firmly. "We work for what we have. Jamal knows that." Robert nodded slowly. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a chance. My company is expanding its community programs. You need someone who understands the people, someone with integrity. Miguel, I want you to lead that work. Miguel's eyes widened. Mr. Mitchell, I didn't go to college. I'm just a construction worker. No, Robert said softly. You're a father who raised a boy who sees people for who they are, not what they have. That's more valuable than any diploma. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy but full of meaning. Then Carmen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Our dignity isn't rented from the rich, Mr. Mitchell. It's the one thing no one can take from us. Before Robert could respond, another voice entered the room. James Thompson, Robert's longtime attorney, had arrived carrying a thick folder. He placed it on the table, his face grim. Robert, you need to see this. He spread out documents, maps, city council approvals. This isn't just prejudice from a few families, it's systematic. Patricia Vanderbilt and her allies are pushing a plan to buy this entire complex for pennies, force every family out, and replace it with luxury condominiums. Robert felt the blood drain from his face. He looked around the Rodriguez home, the drawings on the wall, the steaming plates of food, the boys' laughter drifting from the bedroom, and the weight of it crushed him. This wasn't just about Jamal or Emma. It was about a war against families like this. Families who refused to bow their heads despite poverty. Robert clenched his fists, anger surging harder than ever. For the first time, he saw the battle for what it truly was, not a clash of status, but a fight for the very soul of his community. The chamber of the Westfield City Council was built to impress. High ceilings, polished oak benches, the state seal carved into the marble floor. It was the kind of room designed to remind people of power. That night, it was packed. Developers in expensive suits filled the front rows, their gold watches glinting beneath the lights. Patricia Vanderbilt sat among them, draped in her signature Chanel blazer, her chin raised with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already written. Beside her, Charles Morrison flipped through contracts that promised millions, while the mayor shuffled papers with the impatience of a man eager to finish formalities. Item 15 on the agenda, the mayor announced, his voice flat, final approval for the Westfield Gardens project. Patricia allowed herself the smallest of smiles. This was supposed to be her victory lap. Then the doors opened. Heads turned as Robert Mitchell entered, not alone, but flanked by Miguel Rodriguez, James Thompson carrying a bulging folder, 2 federal agents in plain suits, and 3 investigative journalists with cameras already rolling. A murmur rippled through the chamber, rising like the start of a storm. Patricia stiffened but forced a smirk. Desperate man's theatrics, she whispered to Morrison. Robert walked with steady purpose, stopping at the podium. Mr. Mayor. Council members, he began, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to silence the room. Before you cast a vote that will displace dozens of families, I believe you should see what we've uncovered. The mayor shifted nervously. Mr. Mitchell, this meeting is nearly concluded. Then you won't mind if I use just a few minutes to present evidence, Robert replied, motioning to Thompson. The lawyer stepped forward, placing the folder on the podium and opening it with deliberate care. The first sound that filled the chamber wasn't Robert's voice, but Patricia's. A recording played, her words unmistakable. We need to make these people's lives so uncomfortable they'll have no choice but to accept our offer. Cut services, raise fines, do whatever it takes. Gasps erupted. Patricia shot to her feet. That's illegal. That recording can't be used. One of the federal agents stood. It was obtained with a warrant under the Fair Housing Act. You've been under investigation for 3 months. Patricia's face drained of color. The screen behind the council lit up again, this time with emails, her name and Morrison's, alongside city officials. Messages about how to speed up evictions, how to keep property values clean, how to ensure undesirable elements were gone before construction began. Morrison tried to slip toward the exit, but the agents blocked his path, their presence a silent verdict. Thompson turned another page, revealing contracts with falsified appraisals. Council members, this is a coordinated scheme to defraud not only the families of Westfield, but the city itself. Millions stolen in manipulated land values, orchestrated by the very people you trust to represent the community. The chamber buzzed with outrage, voices rising from the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and for the first time Patricia's polished mask began to crack. Robert placed his hands on the podium, leaning forward. His voice was steady, controlled, but laced with fire. For weeks, you've tried to destroy my company, isolate my daughter, and punish my family for one simple reason, because she found a friend in a boy you deemed unworthy. You believed your money and influence gave you the right to dictate the terms of human dignity, but you forgot one thing. While you were busy underestimating us, we were documenting every illegal move you made." Patricia trembled, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. And then, from the back of the chamber, a new sound broke the tension, the squeak of wheels on polished tile. Emma entered, her small frame moving proudly in her chair, Jamal walking beside her. The crowd parted in stunned silence as they approached. Emma's voice, small but unwavering, carried through the chamber. "He's my friend. If that makes me wrong, then I don't want to be right." The words struck like a hammer, shattering the last illusions of superiority that Patricia and her allies clung to. Gasps filled the room, and even council members who had been ready to vote looked down, ashamed. Jamal stood tall beside her, his hand resting gently on the back of her chair, his presence a living rebuke to every prejudice in the room. Patricia collapsed back into her seat, her confidence draining away as cameras flashed to capture her downfall. The mayor cleared his throat, voice shaking. "In light of this evidence, the vote on item 15 is suspended pending federal review." But the decision had already been made. The real trial was not in legal documents or council votes, but in the eyes of the community now watching. Patricia Vanderbilt, once untouchable, sat exposed and broken as the chamber erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunderous cheers for two children who had dared to stand where adults had faltered. Robert glanced at his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. Emma had spoken the truth no one else had dared. And in that moment, he knew this was no longer just about business or reputation. It was about a movement, a fight for something bigger than all of them. The chamber had witnessed more than a scandal that night. It had witnessed the rebirth of justice in the voices of two children who refused to be silent. 6 months later, Westfield was no longer the same city. Where there had once been whispers of exclusion and quiet cruelty, there now stood signs of change. The land Patricia Vanderbilt and her allies had tried to seize had been transformed into something they could never have imagined, a community center buzzing with life. Its walls were painted in bright colors, its halls filled with the sound of children reading, playing, and learning together. On Saturdays, families gathered in the gym for free health clinics sponsored by Mitchell Pharmaceuticals, while volunteers tutored students in classrooms that used to be dreams for parents who had never dared to hope. Robert walked through those halls often, not as a CEO showing off a project, but as a father who had learned what true wealth meant. He passed by Miguel's office, now bearing the title Director of Community Programs. Miguel's once roughened hands now signed papers and shook hands with city leaders, though his pride had never been tied to a title. He still greeted everyone with the same humility, reminding them, "This work isn't about me. It's about dignity for every family who was told they didn't belong." In one of the classrooms, Jamal stood beaming as a teacher announced his latest accomplishment. He had won first place at the state science fair with a project on preventive medicine in underserved communities, an idea he said was inspired by his grandmother's teachings and Robert's company's new initiatives. Emma sat proudly beside him, cheering the loudest, surrounded by real friends who valued her for her wit and courage, not the wheelchair that once made her invisible. Outside, reporters snapped pictures of the two children, calling them symbols of Westfield's rebirth. Yet while the city bloomed, shadows remained. In a modest apartment across town, Patricia Vanderbilt sat alone by her window. Once queen of the social elite, she now lived in obscurity, stripped of her wealth, her influence, and the friends who had abandoned her as quickly as they once followed. She watched children play in the park across the street, their laughter carried on the breeze, but she never stepped outside. She knew she no longer belonged to the world she had tried to control. Her phone rang one evening, and Robert, surprised by the number flashing across his screen, answered after a long pause. "Mr. Mitchell," Patricia's voice quivered, stripped of the authority it once held. "I wanted to apologize. For the things I said, for the things I did. I lost everything and I deserved to, but I finally understand how wrong I was." Robert said nothing, letting the silence weigh. Patricia continued, her voice breaking. "I told myself wealth was measured by money, by power, by appearances, but your daughter, that boy, they taught me something I should have known long ago. True wealth has nothing to do with money." Robert's tone was calm, almost weary. "Your apology doesn't belong to me, Patricia. It belongs to the families you tried to destroy." She drew a shaky breath. "I've already written to them, to Miguel, to Carmen, even to Jamal. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that for the first time in my life I see clearly." When the call ended, Robert sat in his office, staring at the framed picture Emma had drawn, a picture of herself and Jamal holding hands, smiling beneath a sky filled with balloons. He thought about how a single act of kindness at a lonely birthday party had set in motion a chain of events that reshaped an entire city. Justice had come, yes, but not the kind delivered in courtrooms alone. It was a justice that healed through community, through friendship, through the courage of children who refused to let prejudice define their lives. Yet even as Westfield thrived, Robert knew the scars remained. The memory of empty chairs and cruel whispers would never fully fade, but perhaps that was how justice truly worked, not by erasing pain, but by planting something stronger in its place. A garden of dignity, watered by resilience, blooming in the very soil where arrogance once tried to root itself. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.